I have the delight and the pleasure of introducing our first speaker this morning, Dr. Felicia Wusong. She is a sociologist who studies the social and cultural effects of digital technologies on community and identity in contemporary life. She's trained in history, communication studies, and sociology from Yale, Northwestern, and University of Virginia. And she's currently the professor of sociology at Westmont College up in beautiful Santa Barbara. She is the author of a new book titled Restless Devices: Recovering Personhood, Presence, and Place in the Digital Age. And her prior research includes her first book, Virtual Communities, Bowling Alone, Online Together, which was published in 2009, and it explored the democratic efficacy of online communities and other studies on expectant women's online information seeking habits and the evolution of mommy bloggers, which I was one. She serves as an associate editor at Current, an online journal on faith, culture, and politics. And so please, warm welcome to bring up Dr. Felicia Wusong as she talks a little bit about going against the grain, parenting in a digitally saturated society. Welcome, Dr. Song.
Check, check. Okay. That's very loud. All right, thanks everyone. Let me just get settled here. So good to see you all. I wasn't sure with the rain what would happen if there would just be 5 people here. It's a real treat to get to be a part of an AACC event and have a chance to reflect on how we negotiate parenting in this very challenging time. I'm going to take off my glasses because my glasses help me see you right now, but it doesn't help me see what's on my paper. I'm that old. I'm in that place, and I haven't done the bifocal. Progressive. I just can't go there yet. So I'm dealing. Okay, I'll get there. So as a sociologist, as you heard, I do explore the cultural and social impact of digital practices. I'm interested in how the way we use our technologies affects our identity, our sense of community. And even though I'm a sociologist that's been doing this for over 20 years, I'm also a mother. And I have a 13-year-old son who's in 7th grade. He loves Minecraft. I have an 18-year-old daughter who just started college. She follows all her K-beauty influencers on YouTube, keeps up with her friends on Snapchat and BeReal. So I'm in the trenches. I'm with you. I have hardly figured anything out. I am learning and struggling just as you are. So I'd like to start this morning by talking about what the challenge is that we're actually facing as parents, and then touch on what we need to understand about the digital industry and look at some of the research that's been done on the effects of the digital, and then end with a few ideas about how we might approach raising our kids to be the kind of people I think we all hope they will be, caring, resilient, creative, able to stand up in the face of life's challenges and make good choices, because they somehow are able to recognize what's true, what's beautiful, and what's worth living for. A little bit on the challenge. Okay, so here's the challenge. I always like to remind parents a very important fact. If you're raising children right now, you are a pioneer. You are the first generation of parents parenting children with devices like the ones that we have now. No one's ever done this before. We are uncharted territory. So if it feels confusing and crazy, that's why, right? Like, nobody knows what they're doing, right? And even before some of your children were born, some of us might have already anticipated this. We were already worrying about the social ills that we hear about: sexting, cyberbullying, internet addictions, online pornography, and the like. All of us are having to, even apart from those kind of major social ills, all of us are having to make ordinary but significant decisions, like, well, what age should my child have their first phone? When should they go on TikTok? When are they allowed to be on Snapchat? How much time should they be allowed on these devices, right? And so as a parent who happens to be a sociologist, I actually like to draw from the lesson that I teach my introduction to sociology students, all right? So the first thing that we tell them is that a sociological imagination teaches you that our personal troubles are often public issues. So the basic idea is we all experience personal stuff, and it's tied to the particularities of our lives. But those personal things are often actually connected to some broader cultural, social issue that is actually out of our control individually, okay? So in this room, we each have our particularities. You each have different degrees of how much you like technology yourself or don't like technology. Your kids are of varying ages. Some are preschool, some are teenagers, some are out of the house already. Some of our kids swim through the pool of life pretty easily, and some of them don't. These are all individual particularities, right? But all of these personal troubles are often public issues as well. And what we have in common is that we are all going through this together. And just a quick stat, before COVID, 71% of parents with kids 5 to 11 were reporting that they were concerned or very concerned that their children were on their devices too much before COVID, right? We all know, okay, what's it like now, right? And the concern has only increased. Since the pandemic, about 39% of parents say they've been less strict with screen time when it goes beyond schoolwork. So we're not alone. Right? We have each other, and rather than working against each other or being afraid of each other, my hope is that these kinds of events help us to start conversations and to start talking to each other about how we can work together for the sake of our kids. So there are a few questions that I think when we are trying to parent against the digital grain, that I think orient my thinking, at least, and maybe they orient some of yours. So I'm not sure that I'm going to be able to answer all of these questions, but I think it's always good to just name things, and then we can again continue to have conversation afterwards. So some key questions: what's the proper place of technology in the shape or texture of life that I hope my child can live into? What are the practices, technological practices, I want my child to enact to become the kind of person I hope they'll become? And for Christians, what's the gospel vision of what it means to be human that drives how we parent and the ways that we let technology shape our children's relationships and their contact with the world? You'll see in each of these questions, a key part of it is always, what do I hope my child will be, right? And I think that is something we want to hold on to, right? To start forming an idea of as we think through these issues, all right? So the first area I want to unpack is, what does it mean to live in a digital age? Oh, all my animations, all my pacing is off, so I'm sorry about that. I'm not sure if I can be doing anything to change that up. But so the idea here is, when we live in a digital saturated age, one of the key features is that we have a normalized expectation of living in permanent connectivity, okay? And if you look at the history of mass communication and telecommunication, the promise of connection has always been there. You think telegraph, telephone, radio, TV, it's all about connecting, right? The core of the internet and networking, it's all about sharing and connecting information and communication. But we all know that being connected in 2023 is nothing like being connected in the early 90s when we all first got on the internet, Remember that, right? You had to sit down at a desk, right? And then you had to plug that wire in, and then you had to call the number, and it made that sound that I'm not going to replicate because we'd all run out of the room screaming, right? So being connected back then, right, was actually something you did. It was a behavior. You got connected. You called in. I want to argue that being connected today in 2023 is actually closer to a state of consciousness than a behavior, okay? And that's what I'm getting at with permanent connectivity, right? It is something that it's a human condition now, that we just live in a state of permanent connectivity. I'm going to unpack that, okay? The reason why we live in permanent connectivity, some of them are obvious. Our technology is now mobile. It goes with us everywhere. It's on our wrists, it's in our bags, right? A study showed recently that 30% of Americans and about 48% of 18 to 29-year-olds say that they are almost constantly online every day, right? And what makes permanent connectivity compelling isn't just that we have devices everywhere and with us, but I think this is a key point, right? That technology is actually social and embedded now. And what I mean by that isn't just, it lets us talk to each other, like we usually use the word social. What I mean is that it's actually embedded in the existing relationships we have with family, with friends, with school, with work, with church, with community. And we depend on our technologies to maintain those relationships. And so what's happening is all the obligations and commitments that we have to family, friends, church, school, right, work, we're importing them to how we use our technologies in those relationships, right? So this is to say, to be a good parent, I need to be on a device. To be a good friend, I need to use technology. To be a good employee, I need to be available on my phone, right? To be a part of this community, I need to be connected, right? That's what I mean by social and embedded, right? To be a good leader, to be successful, to be reliable, increasingly means being available on our devices, which then drives us to be permanently connected, right? It's not that we necessarily love the device itself. We love our friends, we love our family, we love, right, our community, and that's why we're on there, right? And then last, our technology is infinitely novel in its content. There's always a new email, there's always a new text, there's always a new video, there's always something new, right? I think about my email inbox. It's like the worst thing. It's like a reverse, quicksand. You know, it's like constantly just filling in, right? And I can't move fast enough, right? And so when you mix together this mobile, social, infinite novel aspects of our digital landscape, what you get is this psychological cocktail. Pleasures, anxieties, expectations, it's all mixed together in how we use our devices. And so when I talk about permanent connectivity as a form of consciousness, what I mean is our bodies are here. You are here physically. But our hearts or our minds, might actually be somewhere else because we know there's an email, a post, some comment, something else is happening somewhere else. And I'm trying not to pay attention to it, but I know it's happening, right? And very often we take a peek because we usually think that thing is actually more important than wherever our physical bodies are, right? Like that's just part of the dynamic, right? So whatever we're doing in a meeting, having lunch with our kids, we're permanently connected, right? We're conscious of something happening that we just feel like we need to check, okay? So evidence of this kind of permanent connectivity is also found in how much time we spend on our screen, looking at our screens. So this is pre-COVID data. The average child 8 to 12 in the United States was on their screens about 5 hours a day. For teenagers, it went up to 7.5 hours, almost half their waking hours. Some parents talk about their children's screen times doubling during the pandemic. And lest we think that this is a young person's problem, it's those young people's problem. Parents and adults are just as bad. We spend just as much time as our kids do. Before the pandemic, 56% of parents themselves admitted to being on social media too much. 68% reported being at least sometimes distracted by their phones when spending time with their kids. And this one always is a kicker. 54% of children felt their parents check their devices too much. They see us, they notice, right? And what's interesting about all of this data is that it's not like we're sitting down at a desk, right? Again, it's not like we're sitting down and just pounding out hours on a screen. The cumulative screen time is happening very often with little or no awareness that we're even on the screen. There's this accumulation of micro moments, right? Waiting in the car, in line, in between meetings, right before lunch, right? There's these little nibbles here and there that like accumulate, right? And if you've ever looked at your screen time on your phone, it's like, oh, I didn't realize I was on my phone that much, right? But it's these little habits, right? These little practices that we have that are making up the fullness of the amount of time we're on our screens. So why is it? Why is it that we have become this way, right? Why are we spending so much time on our screens? Why are we checking them even so compulsively, right? And it helps to understand how our technology is designed these days, okay? So a lot of you know this already. The conversation on what tech companies are doing to create the platforms and the media that we use is becoming more known. If you've ever watched the documentary on Netflix, Social Dilemma, it unpacks a lot of this information. But the general idea is that tech companies are using lead-edge insights of behavioral psychology, brain science, finely calibrated algorithms to calculate the most optimal way to keep us tethered to their site, right? The intent is to colonize our attention, right? The intent is to figure out how to make money off of our desires for relationship and a sense of belonging, right? They know this, it's not accidental, right? They know this and they're using, right? They're exploiting the tools of just our human natures, right? They hire casino designers, they hire other experts from other addictive industries to consult on what types of notifications, what color buttons and badges they should use, how much emotional content, right, is training our brains to become activated and hooked on dopamine. And these platforms understand that as human beings, we basically like three things: sexy things, funny things, and violent things, right? And they know that when we're tired, we have very little willpower to resist the autoplay of that next video that's gonna start in about 2 seconds, right? So you're just like, okay, let's just watch another episode, right? So this is vast system, right, of persuasion that we are up against, that our children are up against, right? Which is what, in part, makes it so difficult. It's not just the device, right? It's not just this thing. It's an entire well-funded system of research, really smart, intelligent, brilliant people figuring out how to keep us hooked and permanently connected, right? And so I like to think about, when I think about the effects of all of this permanent connectivity on our physiology, if you're old enough, if you're Gen Xer like me, you might remember growing up watching these commercials on the weekends with the cartoons that said, "This is your brain. This is your brain on drugs," right? And that has the scrambling egg, right? That foreboding, can you hear it, right, with me, right? And so I like to think about that in terms of the digital, right? This is our brain and our bodies on the digital, right? And there's lots of interesting studies. These are not specific to children, and they're just kind of suggested and a little dated, but just kind of, I have them here more for kind of to create kind of an impressionistic understanding of what some of the troubling possibilities might be, right? So there's a study that showed that social media compulsions can be more difficult to resist than desires for tobacco, coffee, alcohol, or eating. Research has shown, and some of you might know this, that just having a phone on the table is enough to distract people when they're talking to someone, to reduce empathy or rapport, so you don't even have to be looking at the phone. It could just be face down, and it's somehow we're distracted by that. And our brains actually do fatigue considerably after heavy multitasking, when we've been on the screens and unable to reason or be creative at our full capacities. Okay, so with these kinds of kind of general impressionistic studies, it's understandable that we would think, okay, so what's happening to our kids and their brains, right? They're still forming, right, brains. And I think there's more research that's being done now that goes beyond the conversations about dopamine, that looks at cortisol, right? How is time spent online activating stress hormones? And how is it that when people are on their phones exposed to social media, news, emails is actually increasing their stress, right? And then we often go to our devices to try to decrease our stress. We're like, reply, right? And then a new email comes up, and then a new stress comes up, right? And so then we're in this weird cortisol cycle, right? And then interesting research, I think, that's being done more and more on sleep. How is our permanent connectivity disrupting our sleep, right? And blue light, if anyone has those blue light glasses, right, you know that there's all this talk about how the blue light suppresses the melatonin hormone that regulates our sleep rhythms, okay? So I'm kind of zipping through this fast because, again, I mean for this to just kind of be impressionistic and also legitimize our concerns for our children, right? Say, yeah, something's happening to us physiologically. We're all in this human experiment, right? Like, none of us knows what's going to happen to all of us, right? For being online in this way. Now, when it comes to thinking about our kids, we do ask, people are always asking, well, how much does heavy tech use contribute to depression, anxiety, loneliness? I'll be interested in what Dr. Park has to say if she has research on this area to present, but my sense of it is that the research is kind of all over the place on these things. And I kind of think that in the next 10, 15 years, as our kids are growing up, that you can get more longitudinal data from kids using technology when they're young, and then you can track them 10 years later and start finding out what's actually the effect. But I think what has been interesting, and I would say, pretty replicated data or replicated research is research that shows that especially with young people, when they are online, the outcome depends on what their starting point is psychologically, right? So if they start off with positive well-being and they go online and spend a lot of time on social media, it goes up. Their well-being continues to go up. They feel more self-esteem, they feel belonging, right? A sense of efficacy. But if they start off with low well-being, psychological well-being, and they go online and are on social media, it usually goes down, right? So it amplifies whatever your starting point is, which then makes us have to think, well, where are our kids at, right? And what we need to do for our kids might be different, right? Even child to child. And so other research has shown that when people are just passively lurking, right? You're just scrolling, you're doing this, on TikTok or social media, right, and you're just doing this, it tends to lead to more negative psychological outcomes, a feeling of comparison. All those people live lives that are better than mine, right, and you're just scrolling. But if people are actively posting or commenting, there tends to be more correlation with positive outcomes, right? Again, a lot of this is correlation data, and it's therefore problematic, right? You don't know where the starting points are, which is why longitudinal data will be helpful. I'm going to skip the boredom thing. I'll come back to it in a second. So one of the conversations, I want to give you resources. I think one of the people that's super interesting that's writing is Sherry Turkle. She's an MIT social psychologist who's written on this area. She researches young people, and she's always been interested in how technology affects people's relationships, young people's capacity to form relationships with each other. And she argues that even though technology connects us with each other, allows us to connect with each other, what it also allows us to do is control and manage people, right? And their access to us. And she, in this book, Reclaiming Conversation, she observes how young people prefer texting over any other sort of communication mode, and is curious about what is that about and what could that lead to. And so she's concerned about what happens when we prefer the screen to learning, having to learn what it is to have the face-to-face conversation and deal with the awkwardness of someone being boring or saying something dumb or saying something, right? Like all those sorts of basic life skills about how to engage someone in all of their fullness, all the different cues that they're giving off in their voice, their body posture, right, to navigate those spaces. She's also concerned about how young people may be not fostering, or they might not be fostering empathy as much with each other when they're just reading things on a screen, and you can hide when you feel uncomfortable. And also what permanent connectivity does to young people when there is no space for boredom, right? That you can always be online to look at something, and that boredom actually is a time when our brains do something else. They reflect, they create narratives that build a sense of self. And so she raises some really interesting points that might be worth looking into. So I want to keep an eye on my time here. So how can we respond as parents? And I think what's interesting is when you actually look at some of the Silicon Valley CEOs, right? And then you find out, like, okay, you guys are making this technology, and then you find out, oh, wait, you send your child to a tech-free school. What's that about, right? It's like, my kid's in a public school, and they got a tablet since they were in kindergarten. You know, you just sold them that tablet, right? Right? And so it's super interesting when you see these CEOs, and they're like super low tech with their kids, right? And you're like, I don't know something, you know, right? And so I think one way we can respond is to think, okay, what are these low-tech Silicon Valley CEOs doing? So what I'm going to put up next is a screen that shows you some rules that some of the CEOs have for their family. And they're going to be stringent, folks. So they definitely limit their children's screen time. They ban all gadgets on school nights. They allocate only 30 minutes to 2 hours on weekends. Parental controls on every device, waiting until 14 for a smartphone. No data plan until 16. No screens in the bedroom, period, ever. Okay? So this is just the low-tech, just as a small sample of what some of the CEOs are doing in their families, right? And a lot of them are saying, hey, we see in our employees what happens when people are online. Like, we see it, so we don't want and we know what's online. We don't want our kids to have any part of that. So They lock it down pretty hard, right? Now, I show you this not as a guide, actually. All right, I know, you're going to take this home and be like, all right, kids, this is what we're going to do, right? But some of these points might be effective for your family, right? But one of the things I really do believe is every family and every child is different, right? And you're the one who knows your family. You need to discern and decide what limits and boundaries are best. So I think it's helpful to, again, think less about what are the fences and the rules I've got to set up, and think more about what kind of kid do I want, what kind of person do I want my child to become, and have that drive whatever, right, boundaries and settings you might have for your family. Okay? So this is in part just to say it's okay if you're going to go, hardcore. There's some folks going hardcore up in Silicon Valley, but you need to discern, okay? As a person of faith, I think it is, we need some kind of approach, some faith-informed way of thinking about digital technologies. And I actually find the work that James K. Smith does in his book, You Are What You Love to Be, super helpful to think about how our digital habits of permanent connectivity are actually what he calls secular liturgies, okay? And what he means by secular liturgies are they are habits or rituals that misform our desires away from the kingdom of God. Right, so if you think of liturgies, usually it's a church term, right? Liturgies, on Sunday we participate in a liturgy, and the idea is it's some kind of practice, some set of words or some form of worship, right, that is meant to focus us on the kingdom of God. A secular liturgy pulls us away from it. It is also a pattern and a habit, right? And so he writes, the way our desires get aimed in specific directions is through practices that shape, mold, and direct our loves. Habits are formed by practices, routines that inscribe particular ongoing habits into our character such that they become secondary nature to us. Some of the habits and practices we are regularly immersed in are actually thick, formative practices that over time embed in us desires for a particular version of the good life. Okay, so the idea here is what forms us is not what we know or what we think. What forms us and our children is actually what we're doing with our bodies all the time, right? And I think it's really interesting because a lot of us actually know a whole lot, right, about how we should live, or we know that these tech companies are doing all this stuff to us. And I don't know if you've ever sat your child down and tried to explain to them, tech companies are doing this to you. They're manipulating you, right? Like I've had this guy like, don't you know, doesn't that make you angry? They're like, right? right? And that's the thing. It's like you can tell people things, right? And we tell ourselves things, but our life isn't transformed. Right, which is why I find Smith's secular liturgies to be really interesting, because he's saying, no, it's in our bodies, right? We are doing things viscerally with our bodies. If you've been an athlete, a musician, an artist, you know this, right? You train your body in such a way that it's automatic. You don't even think about it anymore, right? And it just becomes a part of you. It becomes a part of your character. And so when I think about raising kids, or when I think about ourselves, it's about the habits, the secular liturgies that we don't even think about, that we've trained ourselves to always look at our phones in between meetings or to check while I'm waiting online, right? All of that is forming us in some way to become some kind of person. And the question is, well, what kind of person is that? And is that the kind of person I want to be? Is that the kind of person I want my child to be, right? And so what Smith argues is what we need to do is identify where our secular liturgies are, and maybe we want to pull back on them, okay? But importantly, what we actually want to do is engage in counter liturgies. Counter liturgies are practices that push back against the misformation of our heart and redirects us to the kingdom of God. Okay? And the idea here is it's not just about getting rid of the bad stuff, right? I think as parents, we're always just like, get rid of the bad stuff, right? And we don't necessarily think about how do we fill, right? How do we fill our children and ourselves with the good stuff, right? And so we need to be asking, well, what can we be doing? What new habits, what new routines can we be instilling in our lives, right? That might kind of just shift, right? Shift things just ever so slightly so that we can take a peek at the life that God has for us. And so what I want to end with is 2 categories of experiments that might be worth trying, okay? Experiments in monotasking and experiments in protecting sacred time and place. So the idea here is that if we think that our permanent connectivity actually trains us in secular liturgies of multitasking, maybe we can take on counter liturgies of monotasking. I'll talk about what that is in a second. And again, if our permanent connectivity leads us to secular liturgies where we're on our devices all the time, thinking all the time, maybe we can create counter liturgies that have sacred tech-free places or times, right? And again, this isn't about like throwing all the digital out, right? This is trying to be realistic about how we need to actually figure out how to live with the digital in our lives, okay? So the monotasking has to do with presence. A lot of us are really concerned about how present our children will be with other people, how present we might even be when we're on our devices with others, okay? And when I talk about presence, right, we might start with asking, well, what does it mean to even be present? Do I even remember what it feels like to not have email, social media feeds, unfinished text exchanges humming in the back of my consciousness, right? Like, do we even remember what it's like to not have all that consciousness, permanent connectivity consciousness in our lives, right? Can I stop multitasking and try monotasking? Okay, so what monotasking is what it sounds like. When you do something, you do just that one thing. So, when you drive, you just drive, right? And so I tried this. I like to experiment on myself, right? So you only do this when you're in the car alone. If someone's with you, you should talk to them, right? But when you're in the car and you're driving, instead of turning on the podcast or all the stuff you do, music, just drive and see what happens, right? In the beginning, it might be really uncomfortable. It was really uncomfortable for me when I started because I'm like a podcast content all the time, right? Got to use time, right? But I stopped, and it was very quiet, and it was very uncomfortable. But I kept doing it. And when I kept doing it, I started noticing things in my neighborhood that I hadn't noticed because I was just, when I was listening, I just wasn't paying attention. I noticed people. And then, even better, as I kept doing it, I started hearing God. And I started hearing myself, who I don't ever hear, right, when I'm running around like a crazy person, right? And so those 10 minutes driving to school, right, dropping off, became sacred times for me. It was so quiet. It was so great. I would start praying, right? So they became precious to me. And it could be lots of different things. Driving, when you're eating, just eating, doing laundry, just doing, right? Pick whatever it is. And so much of it is about, right, as parents, can we be present to our children, right? And what would that look like? And you'll notice I'm using the word experiment, okay? I'm not using rule. I'm not using this is what you need to do. Experiments, I'm a social scientist. I love thinking about experiments because experiments is about data, right? A good experiment gets you good data. There's no success or failure, right? It's not a New Year's resolution. It's not like, I'm going to monotask for 5 hours. It's not that, right? It's just, I'm going to just try this thing and kind of see how it goes. And maybe you try this thing and you like totally fail, right? Like, I can't drive. I need to listen to a podcast. That's okay. right? You notice that about yourself, and you're like, okay. And you bring that into your prayer life. What is about that? What is that about, Lord? Why can't I be quiet? What am I anxious about? What am I nervous about that I can't just be still, right? Non-finding is a good finding, right? As we like to say when we do research, right? Like the thing that you're hoping for, if you don't get it, you still learn something from it. And so it's all about kind of being intentional, about paying attention to yourself and being like, okay, what's this about, right? The next set of experiments are about protecting sacred spaces and times, okay? And so again, this might just be about finding, again, these are all, you could pick one. Don't try them all at once, right? Because you'll all keel over. But think about, right, like, is there a table in the house, a dining table that can be tech-free for a certain period of time, right? Is there a room, like a bedroom, that should be screen-free because that room is for rest, right? Tech-free conversations in the car or meals. Are there digital Sabbaths I can take? If I can't do it for a whole day, maybe it's just an hour, okay? And it's about finding rest. It's about finding solitude. It's about being able to be quiet enough in our interior to settle down, right? And this one's the one I actually recommend a lot to folks, is to think about if you're someone who wakes up and you look at your phone, or right before you go to bed, you look at your phone, I suggest, hey, why don't you try just 15 minutes? Okay, first 15 minutes after you wake up, just don't look at your phone, just for 15 minutes. That can become a sacred time for you. Before you see all those emails, those terrible emails, you get all those texts, right? Whatever, or right before you go to bed, 15 minutes. Calm down. You don't need to know what's happening. It's a protected space, right? You and your family, or just you alone, just quieting down. These are counter liturgies that can redirect our loves towards the kingdom of God, right? God created us to be, we are limited in our human bodies. We need rest, right? And we need solitude to be able to be with God and know what's going on in ourselves, okay? I am very aware of my time, so I'm going to skip over a bunch of things here. Maybe what I'll end with is, let's do this. So one of the things I always tell parents, and this is always telling myself too, is whatever you want your kids to do, you got to do it yourself, right? You have to model the behavior you want, right? It's just how it works, right? They're watching us, and they're like, you can't give them a rule, and then they're like, hey, look at you, you're doing all this stuff, right? So you can try the experiments. You can invite your family to participate with you, right? And then this one's really hard, but it's something I'm learning myself. A wise friend of mine who's further along in the parenting told me this. She said, parenting requires vulnerability. And I was like, nah, that's not good, right? And she's like, you're gonna have to tell your kids, like when you're struggling, like that's okay, you need to be open to them, right? And I've thought about that with my technology habits, right? Is to be able to name for my children, like, hey, I struggle with this too. Like, I don't have this figured out. Like, mom cannot get herself off her, phone in this way also. I'm anxious also when I'm not on my phone, right? And so naming that with our children and having that conversation, right, so that it's not a power thing, right? And it's more just like, we're all in this together. We don't know what's going on, but we're going to try our best, right, to live towards a life that is worth living, okay? All right, so I'm going to speed up and go to the last thing here. This. Okay. Again, depending on what your approach is to the digital, I find that most parents that show up at a parenting talk are anxious and they think digital is bad. So this is framed towards that, okay? So I think it's very easy to think of the digital as a vice, like being on digital devices is as bad as smoking, drinking alcohol, right? Like that kind of vice that we want to get out of our children's lives or prevent them from having. But the thing is, digital's not like one of those vices, because we need it for school, we need it for work, we need it for family, we need it for friends, right? It's embedded. So I actually think it's more appropriate for us to think of it like food. We have to eat food, right, to live. But there are good diets and there are bad diets. And we have spent a lot of time already helping our children try to eat in a healthy way, right, since they were really little, right, and fostering certain tastes, right, trying to get them to eat those vegetables so that later in life they'll eat those right, like to get that in them. And so, so we have different diets, right, we have healthy diets, unhealthy diets, and we also like food, right, we have well-ordered relationships with food, or we don't, right? People have eating disorders, they have, right? So it might be more like food, right? And I think that might be a good starting point as you're thinking in your families, like how have I tried to introduce and shape the way my child interacts with food and relates to food in a healthy, well-ordered way? How can I bring those same kinds of strategies, right, into the life of the technology, because it's quite similar. Okay, thanks so much. Sorry I went over. We'll do some Q&A, and hopefully we'll answer the questions you actually want answered.
Thank you, Dr. Song. That was great. Got some good notes here. Okay, the way that we're going to do Q&A is you're going to see up on the screen in just 1 second. You're gonna go to slido.com and stick in that number. Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
Come on, guys.
Okay. It's okay. We just said technology is not a vice, right?
Technology is not a vice.
It's a food. It's a food.
All right, come on. Okay, get out your devices. Get onto slido.com. And yeah, I know there's a long string of numbers, but we're going to leave this slide up here for all of you so that you can, because I can't remember like 3 numbers. Oh no! Okay. I was literally like number 2043963. So type in your question there, and we're going to choose a few from there. And I am going to... and then I'll read out the question out loud for Dr. Song to answer them. But in the meantime, Dr. Song, what's one of the counter liturgies that you've put into practice for your own family, if I could ask?
Yeah. So one of the counter liturgies is that we, in the evenings, all of us are supposed to charge our cell phones at the family charging station. It's got multiple spaces, everyone's got their lane, right? And it's on the opposite side of the house from all of our bedrooms. It is the farthest place that it can be. And so no phones in your room at night, right? And no devices, like laptops, everybody like out, right? All out in another room. And that's just to create the smallest of buffers, right, in the morning. When our children wake up, when I wake up, I kind of do the 30 minutes before, when I wake up, I don't look at my phone for 30 minutes. None of my other family members do that. I'll be open about that, right? But I know I need that, right? It helps me get grounded. And so that's one of the things that we do.
That's awesome. We have this charging station that's like far away from our bedrooms. Yeah, so I totally. Okay, one of the questions is, what do you do when kids need computer access for homework, especially in high school? And I know this is like a big thing because this happens really frequently, and I know our public schools, they definitely use technology a lot. So what's kind of your maybe guidance on that?
Yeah. Ooh, yeah. I think schoolwork's really challenging. What we try to do is So for high school, so it's tricky, right? So for a while we started off with, all right, if you're going to do your homework, you're going to do it in this space, this public space, right? Dining room, wherever there's a place that mom or dad can kind of like walk by and see that we're actually doing work, right? And we're not doing everything else. And of course, our children are very smart and brilliant. And they have ways of making things go up and down, right? Like, we all know that, right? So it's not like a sure system, but it's something that we can do. Actually, when my daughter started high school, I introduced her to one of those apps that I think it's called the Freedom app, which actually turns off other sorts of websites and platforms during a certain time. So I'd have her set it so that during her homework time, it turned everything else off, and she's supposed to just do her work. Now I know she has to go online and she has to do research, and so that complicated things. So we'd, have to set it to be like, okay, you could go on, YouTube or whatever, But at least we can turn off Instagram, and we can turn off messaging. We could turn those things off so you can just get work done. So for us, I don't know what the full nature of the question is. For us, our challenge was always attention and focus. Do your homework. Don't be doing all these other things at the same time. And so finding some of those software that helps. I introduced it to her because I use it. I need that myself when I'm doing my work. So that's one way.
Yeah, I use the Freedom app also.
Yeah.
It's awesome. Helps me to stay off of scrolling Instagram for like 10 hours.
Totally.
And then I'm like, oh my gosh, it's already 9 p.m. Someone forgot to feed the family dinner. It's too busy on Instagram. Okay, so here, this question, I get asked this a lot actually as a pastor to youth, is parents ask me this a lot. What if my child says this is the only way to have friends? Yeah. And so if I reduce my time, on the social media, like Snapchat, Be Real, that I'll lose my friends.
Yeah.
What do you, how do you respond to that?
I know. So this is about how much time you're on one of those platforms? Is that what it is?
It's not just, I think, about time, but I think a common complaint that I hear from kids, especially from teenagers, is that, well, Mom, all my friends are on Snapchat.
Yep.
So
Yep.
I need time on Snapchat.
Yep.
Or
Yep.
also you shut off my Snapchat at 8 p.m., but my friends are on till 10 p.m.
Yeah.
I'm not going to know what's going on.
Right. Yeah. I'm going to guess this is a question that Dr. Park can answer more than I can. But I'll just draw from our own life experience because we had that conversation all the time in our family. So we did let our daughter have social media access, but very specific ones. She's still not on TikTok because I think that one is absolutely insidious. But she's on Insta and Snapchat. And then we would bound not when she was on, but amount of time. So it was just on a limit. And when there were certain times when, for some reason, she needed to be on more, we'd give her we'd have a conversation and we'd give her permission to have more time. To me, and this is the part that I actually find most fatiguing and exhausting as a parent also. To me, it's about, all these issues is about being able to sit down and actually have a conversation, not a rule, reward penalty kind of thing. But to sit down and be tell me what's tell me what it is that's happening, and not in a defensive way, why do you need this? Explain, not like that, but tell me what it's like. Tell me what it's like to not have, what is actually happening, right? So that we're actually having those substantive conversations that are not about power and parenting and rules, but actually we're learning something about what our kid is stressed about, right? And then maybe some of it, the conversation sometimes I have found goes beyond technology, right? It's about friendship. It's about what's a healthy relationship look like? What are your friends expecting of you? Does that seem like a healthy expectation, right, for a human being? And having those conversations, and then getting to okay, well, let's figure out what's going to work. And sometimes it's about, let's try this. If you're going to change something that's not like that, that's beyond what your rule is, whatever your family rule is, let's try this for a period of time, right? Let's try this for a week, 2 weeks, whatever, and let's see how it is, and we'll come back and have a conversation, right? And have that be an organic process.
Yeah, I really love that you're asking the child, what is it like? Because we don't know what it was like, because we didn't have this problem. I had to find my friends in real life.
Yeah.
Like I didn't have. Yeah. Anyway, that's another topic for another day. This is also a common question I think that comes up with a lot of families, is kind of from your research, and I don't know if you've actually done this specific research, but what is the most concerning social media platform for children and teens?
Ooh. Yeah, I'm not really sure. I mean, there are some that are, are we just talking about like the mainstream ones, or are we talking about like the ones that are, I mean, there's plenty of really crazy ones out there.
Let's go with mainstream.
Yeah, so I'm actually going to dodge this for a reason. Okay, this is my reason. One, in part, because I'm not really sure. I already told you my feelings about TikTok, so you know that. Like my approach to technology is this: it's not app or platform specific, because the apps and platforms are just going to keep changing. They're going to be changing all the time. And having it be specific to one thing, you're gonna get some rule set, and then like tomorrow it's gonna be the next thing, right? Like Be Real just popped up, a couple years ago. And you're like, what? Oh no, there's this other thing now. I just figured out Snapchat, right? So it's just it's constant, right? And I think parents do need to kind of learn the app too, right? So you know what's going on. So this is where I think what I was saying in the beginning of the talk is important. What we need to be guided by is not the specific thing that we're concerned about, the app or the platform. What we need to be guided by are the picture of the kind of person we want our child to become, the picture of the kind of person we feel that God wants me to become, right? We start there and we work backwards. So if you start with the picture, I want to be someone who can be present and notice when someone's upset or needs me. And I'm not doing this, right? I want to become that kind of person. I want my child to become that kind of, okay, well, how do we get there, right? And it could look different for every family and every child and every individual, but needing to articulate up front, what is that vision? I want to be someone who's present. I want to be someone who knows how to rest. I want to be someone who can be empathetic. And we work backwards, then whatever tech comes, then we figure it out as it goes. I think that's the hard work we actually need to do, is figure out, well, what are those things?
So we're not naming specific apps. I'm just
Sorry.
kidding. I'm not going to press you on that, because you're so right. I mean, TikTok was happening, and I still haven't figured it out.
No.
And then Be Real showed up, and I was like, what the heck is Be Real?
Exactly.
And then now there's something else, too, that the kids, and they won't tell me what it is.
No.
My youth group kids, they're just like, you're too old for it.
Yeah.
Pastor Phyllis.
Yeah. Well, and by the time we figure it out,
yeah, exactly.
It'll be AI or VR, or we're going to have a chip in our brain.
Yeah, something
We're going to be in the metaverse. You're
right.
Like whatever it is.
You're right.
But that's the thing about like having the constancy of what does it mean to be human? What does it mean to have healthy relationships?
Yeah.
Start there.
Yeah.
Work backwards.
Yeah, that is like sound, good advice all around. Okay, so you have a child who's 18. Mm-hmm. So this question is great. So for children who are over 18 years old, how do we have the conversation about their screen time? Because now they're adults legally. I mean, if they're in college, I still think, if I'm paying for your college, you're still my child. But legally, they're adults. So how do you have that conversation about screen time? It's not like, you could set limits on their phones, right?
Yeah. Well, so I just started this, so I don't really know personally. I actually think a lot has to do with whether your child is paying for their phone and their data. If they're paying for their phone and their data and they're running that data up and they're paying for it, though, there's a part of me that's like, okay, if you're going to pay for that data, but if it's my data, I get to have a much bigger right to have that conversation. But let's say it's the case where they're already very independent, right? That they're paying for they're on their own. To me, I think it's about, I don't know, it's so much about how they are when they are with you, right? It's like if they're with you, and they're just like, yeah, or they got the earbud in their ear, walking around the whole time through the house, right? Right? It's you have to notice something, right, that troubles you, and then again start the conversation. I don't know how it works to just ask them, so how's your screen time, right? Like that seems kind of, I don't know how that works, but to me that's what I'm anticipating, I guess, in my own life, is just depending on how her habits are, and if we were with grandma and grandpa and you're, like, okay, like, do you feel like you have to? Are you bored? Are you like, let's try to be respectful here, right? And have those conversations like that. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. All right, what do you do as a parent in helping your kids monotask? And how do you explain the value of monotasking in a multitasking world?
Yeah, that's really good. That's really good. Yeah, it's impossible. They don't understand it. Yeah, this is why experiments is good, and starting really small. And I think, I don't know about you, but I'm someone who thinks that when I want to make a change, I have to go big. Like I have to, like everything has to be, change or whatever. And so for me, like this approach, which is small, incremental, experimental, is low stakes, low pressure, right? Let's just try 10 minutes. Let's just see what it's like. And the idea for monotasking, and the pandemic, I'll say this, the pandemic was an interesting time for our family, right? Because one of the things that I do believe, and what James K. Smith argues, is that, right, our hearts are designed for communion with God, right? We are going to be drawn to the beautiful and the true, right, and the good. And we need to trust that in our children, right? And so if I send my son out after he's been playing Minecraft for too long, right, go outside and whittle some, wood, which is actually what he likes doing. And that was something we got going during the pandemic. It's like, here's an activity, right? Go hang out. Just do it for 10 minutes, 15 minutes, 30 minutes. Breathe some air, right? Not on a screen, and just see what happens, right? And the idea is this. We are desiring creatures. We have appetites. When we taste something good, we know it, right? And so it's about thinking about monotasking as giving our children opportunities to taste something good that we know is good, right? Taking a walk on the beach, all these kinds of things that we know is good, that will just fill them up with something, even if they're like, like I can't, right? They're grumpy, but then they're out there and there might be a moment, right? And so for me, it's about, COVID was all about like, what can I find that's good for my child, that I can remind them, you actually love art. You actually do like painting. Do you remember that? Right? Here's some painting supplies, right? Here's a lot of space and a lot of things. Let's just spend an hour painting, right? And letting them remember, like, oh yeah, I really like this. Oh yeah, I really like doing this non-screen activity, right? And trying to foster that appetite, I think, is the way to go.
Thank you. Okay. Speaking of experimenting, do you think that we should experiment on trusting the teen, not an 18-year-old, but a teen, like maybe 13 starting, to manage and balance their use of tech? What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that's totally a worthwhile experiment, depending on your child and depending on where you're at in that relationship. Sometimes if there's so much resistance, right, maybe it's like, okay, let's try this for a few days or a couple weeks. Let's see how this goes, right? And again, I think it's about that experiment is done bounded by conversation, right? Here's the parameters, this is how long we're gonna go, we're gonna have this conversation afterwards, and then we'll see what can happen from there. But I actually think, so this is a personal opinion, I don't know how this all works. Of course, everything I've been saying is personal, so that was dumb. But I actually think phones make trusting our kids very difficult because we can track them. Like you can, the Find Your Phone, we can see wherever they are. We can surveil them in ways that my parents never could surveil. Like when I went to college. Like my parents had no idea what I was doing, where I was. I called them once a week at a given time. That's it. They had no idea, right? But we can, right? We have the opportunity to track them in ways that our parents never did. And I actually find that problematic for myself, like with an 18-year-old, because I want to be able to trust her, right? And I want her to feel trusted, right? So again, I'm not saying this as a rule or a guideline. I think it's very individual to your child and your family. But when my daughter, we had the Find Your Phone with my daughter all through high school. But when she went to college, I said to her, we're going to keep this. Like, you're still going to be logged in just for emergency purposes. And she's out at school on the East Coast and has to fly back and forth, But I'm going to promise you, I'm going to do everything in my power not to look at it while you're in college, because I want to be able to trust you, right? And I wanted her to know that, right? And be like, I want to be able to trust you. It's important for you to grow up and be independent, right? Obviously, whenever you need us, we're here, right? And I have this device and I know, right? But I'm just telling you, this is the way I'm choosing to navigate this, right? And it's not like the way every other parent's going to do this. This is what we're going to do, right? And so I think, again, it's that conversation that is about building a relationship with our kids.
Yeah, I mean, when I went to college and there was like a set time, but then somehow my mom, I don't know, moms always know.
Well, they do know.
Right? It's like we have a spidey sense for when our kids are doing
very true.
Bad things. So don't worry. If you can't track it on your phone, just trust your spidey sense. Okay, I'm going to ask just one more question because we're going to go to a break time in just a minute. But I really like this question a lot. And then I will answer, Lisa, I don't know who you are in this room, but I will make sure that we answer your question later. Okay, yeah, because that's a good question. Do you have any guidance for transitioning and preparing kids that are 17 and they're just kind of going on to, or they might be 18 right now, but then transitioning, like leaving your house and maybe going off to school or kind of doing the next thing in their life, so that you can prepare them to be ready to go from, whatever family rules you might have to, I don't want to say no rules because there's still some rules, but a lot more freedom, especially when they go off to school and it's not maybe nearby. How do you take those baby steps to kind of loosening those rules?
I don't know. Again, I'm really just in it myself, and I'm learning as I go. When my daughter went off to college, we had some conversations about the controls that we took off of her phone. We're at a place where we're starting to talk about, hey, maybe you need to pay for your own phone and your own data. Trying to get in. And so how are you going to do that? Maybe you need to get a job, right? And so... for our family, the tech conversation is how do I put this? It's like a normalized conversation. It's not like the sex talk, or, it's not like we're going to talk about technology, like it's, right? And I don't know what it's like in your family, right? But I think normalizing the conversation is really helpful, right? So it's not like, you've been very bad, or like, now you're moving on to some, right? It's just like, hey, this is what's happening. Maybe you want to think about these things, right? Obviously, you're going to be able to do whatever you want, right? But to be the kind of person you want to be, you need to be cognizant and be self-aware. And having our kids become self-aware is like 90% of the battle, probably, right? And so I think it really is about keeping the conversation. At least that's what I have found to be helpful, and I also find it to be the hardest part as a parent, because I don't always want to have those conversations, playing the heavy all the time, but trying to normalize it as much as possible might be helpful.
Thank you, Dr.
Okay.
Song. Can
Thanks,
we give
everyone.
her
Appreciate
another
it.
round of applause?